Welcome to the Jubilee Diaries for this week. We're in the church porch again because actually, although it's quite hot, it's actually really windy today, so we're in the porch away from the wind. We're thinking this week about God's love and about judgment and about how we hold the tension between those together. And I wanted to talk in the Royal Challenge a little bit about how people's churchmanship, so the churches that they grew up in and that they worship in, affect their thoughts about what heaven and hell are like and what judgment might be like. So traditionally associated with you have to make an adult decision to follow Christ in order to be saved, in a very traditional sort of often more literal interpretation of the whole of the Bible settings. There are some people in the Church of England who are like that. They tend to be very focused on we have to tell everybody about Jesus so they can be saved. And for those people, there's a real understanding that actually hell might not be empty, that there might be people who haven't heard that we could have failed, who will end up in hell rather than heaven. At the other end of the spectrum, there are people who absolutely believe that God's love will sort all this out, that hell will be empty because everybody will find a chance to be with God, and that God loves them so much that he will sort it all out, and so hell will be empty because this is God's work, not our work. There's actually some really deep theology behind this, but for the Rural Challenge I wanted to think about this being somewhere where, it's a church where people from all sorts of churchmanships gather together. So you will have people in your own congregation in a rural setting who have quite widely differing views on this. And that is a challenge. It's a challenge for us to live in harmony together, whilst some people might be thinking, actually, I don't even know if you're a Christian. Does that mean you're going to hell? And some people will be thinking, of course, everybody who gathers here will be going to heaven because God loves everybody so much. And it affects how we tell the story of God, what our mission looks like, the kind of whether there's a desperation with mission. And so actually it affects everybody in the church community, but it's something we don't really talk about very much because we don't like to culturally, we don't want to talk about it. So it's important in your church community, whatever you think about judgment and heaven and hell, and whether hell is empty or whether there will be people in hell and what that will look like. Actually, other people will have other views in your community, and how do we work together as the church, even with these people who have very differing views about something which people may view as fundamental. This week we've got two readings which seem to hold a tension, a theological tension, which we all grapple with. So the Romans reading talks about nothing separating us from God's love. So we have Romans 8:26 to the end, and it's like, well, what could separate us from God's love? Could famine or persecution or the sword or death separate us from God's love? No, none of these things can separate us from God's love in Jesus. That's the theological working out that Paul has done in his writing to the Romans. Nothing can separate us from God's love. The Gospel reading which we have, which is parts of Matthew 13, talking about the kingdom. So there's 5 different illustrations of the kingdom, but it does contain a part of one of those illustrations is about the righteous being separated out from the evil, that the angels will separate the righteous from the evil, and the evil will be in the fiery furnace effectively. So it's difficult. So we have one scene of judgment, and we have one scene of infinite mercy and grace. And it's something that we all have to hold in our tension, in our theology. We have to think about it for ourselves. So I wanted to share 3 things that I often think about when I'm trying to hold this theological tension. And the first one is something which was said to me a very, very long time ago. The church where I grew up as a teenager was kind of very straight down the line, sort of 1980s evangelical. People need to make their own adult commitment to God so that they can be guaranteed of being saved and having their place in heaven. And I was friends there during my late teens with some of the people in their younger 20s, and one of those people had tragically lost her parents, who were killed at the same time in a road traffic accident. And we were in an appropriate situation for me to talk to her about it. She was talking to me, and I said, were they Christians? And she knew the code. She knew that what I was asking was, how do you know that they're in heaven? And it was really interesting because her response was not one that I was expecting, but was really powerful. And she said to me, I don't know what they believed. I don't know if they turned to God in the last moments of their consciousness. I don't know. But what I do know is that God loves them more than I could ever love them. However much I love them, God loves them more. And I found that a really important challenge to my thinking. It trod a different path from some of the teaching which I had previously received. The other thing I often think about is the saying from Philip Yancey's book, What's So Amazing About Grace, which is truncated. It's actually kind of a summary of a paragraph where it says, nothing we can do will make God love us any more, and nothing we can do will make God love us any less. And that's often tied up with this passage from Romans 8. Nothing we can do will make God love us any more, and nothing we can do will make God love us any less. I've used that all the way through my ministry. I've used it as encouragements in difficult times, in funerals, in difficult circumstances. I've talked to individuals about it. I've used it a lot because I think it's a really important thing for lots of people to remember. So I was disappointed when I found out in the early part of this year that Philip Yancey had had a really long-term affair with someone. I was disappointed, not as disappointed as his wife, but I was disappointed in that way when a Christian teacher that you hoped was doing okay hadn't been doing okay. But it doesn't mean that that saying isn't true. If your Christian leader disappoints you, which they almost invariably will over something, then it doesn't necessarily mean that their teaching is invalid. So it's still true that nothing we can do will make God love us any more, and nothing we can do will make God love us any less. The third thing I think about when I'm thinking about, righteousness and judgment and all these things, is the story of the person who's traditionally known as the thief on the cross, the criminal on the cross next to Jesus who admits he's guilty. He knows that he's being punished and that he's guilty of the charges against him. But he says to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says to him, today you will be with me in paradise. Today you will be with me in paradise. This is a very complicated statement, but mainly today I want to think not about the issues about time and the fact that Jesus is saying today. is about the fact that that person, the criminal who was on the cross next to Jesus, had no time to do any righteous acts. He had no time for what is termed in some of our old-fashioned prayers. He had no time for amendment of life. He had no time to do that. All he had time to do was to cry out to Jesus. And all Jesus did was grant him a place with Jesus for eternity. So these are the things that I use to help me think about this tension between understanding that God loves everyone and nothing can ever stop that love, and we need to hold that with the stories about judgment which Jesus talks about. How do we hold those in tension? How do we work that out? How do we ponder that when we listen to both sides of the story? The Dibbly moment of the week this week is about a grave which I had in one of my churchyards somewhere where I'd worked. It was a rectangular grave, kind of normal, and then on top of it, it had a pyramid which was built. It was a kind of odd-shaped pyramid because it was a very long, thin rectangle as its base, but it was definitely a pyramid. Apparently, the person whose grave it was had it built so that his wife couldn't dance on his grave. And I've been wondering this week, I wonder what that shows us about what he thought about life and death and judgment. Well, that's it for the Dibbly Diaries for this week. I pray that you and your village, however large or small, have a really blessed week where you will all know the love of God.